something is terribly wrong. The Storm Prediction Center almost never does this. They just posted a 15% severe probability 4 days in advance, and to put that into perspective, it is the meteorological equivalent of a doctor calling you at midnight. They don't do it unless the test results are genuinely alarming, and right now, the results are alarming. Supercells are loading 3,000 joules of energy over the plains, 8 rivers are flooding simultaneously in New York, Montana is disappearing under a foot of snow, grasslands in Nebraska are burning, and a solar storm from an X 1.4 flare is quietly hammering Earth's magnetosphere. Oh, and 4 astronauts are about to launch toward the moon, directly into it. Stay with me until the end, because what all of this adds up to is something forecasters are only beginning to say out loud, and the part they're most reluctant to say is the part you need to hear. If this has you hooked, subscribe to the Sky Lab, and tell me what you think below. After the dryline supercells, the 8 flooding rivers, the blizzards bearing Montana, and a solar flare hammering the magnetosphere all in the same week, is the atmosphere telling us something about where things are heading, or are we simply standing in the middle of a very loud coincidence? Let me know what you think. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The forecast that shouldn't exist. Something is wrong with this forecast. Not wrong as in incorrect, wrong as in it shouldn't exist yet. When the Storm Prediction Center issues an enhanced risk 2 days out, that's normal. When they post a 15% severe probability 4 days in advance, that is not normal. That is a signal. And if you know how to read it, it should make you stop whatever you're doing and pay attention. Here's why that number matters. The Storm Prediction Center, the SPC, is one of the most cautious scientific institutions in the country. These are people who have spent careers watching confident forecasts collapse into nothing, and nothing forecasts explode into catastrophe. They do not use aggressive long-range probabilities unless something in the data is screaming at them. 15% severe probability 4 days out is not them hedging. It is them saying, we see this coming, we have seen it across multiple models, and we're telling you now because the window to prepare is closing. 15% might sound small, it isn't. In the language of severe weather forecasting, 15% at extended range typically precedes moderate risk upgrades as the event gets closer. It means the atmosphere is not being subtle. It means the models, which often disagree, which often split into wildly different solutions depending on which one you trust, are actually talking to each other right now. The GFS and the ECMWF, 2 of the most powerful forecasting systems on the planet, are telling essentially the same story. That alignment alone should raise the hair on your arms, and then you look at the energy numbers. CAPE, convective available potential energy, is the fuel gauge of the atmosphere. It measures how much energy is available to drive a thunderstorm upward. In a typical spring severe weather event, you might see CAPE values in the range of 1,000 to 2,000 joules per kilogram. That's enough to produce significant storms. The setup we're tracking right now, 3,000 joules per kilogram. In early April, let that land for a second. We are seeing near-peak season instability, the kind of energy usually reserved for late May or June in the southern plains, loading into the atmosphere right now. The calendar says April. The atmosphere did not get the memo. But here's where it gets more specific and more unsettling. When forecasters talk about storm initiation, they usually deal in windows of uncertainty. A 6-hour window, an 8-hour window, maybe a broad afternoon to evening time frame. The storm initiation window for Wednesday evening has been narrowed to 3 hours. 3. That level of precision does not come from luck. It comes from an unusually predictable trigger mechanism, and the trigger in this case is the dry line, a boundary between moist air flowing in from the Gulf of Mexico and hot, dry air surging east from the desert southwest. That boundary is acting like a loaded gun right now, and forecasters can see almost exactly when and where the trigger will be pulled. Here's the part that matters most. This is not one storm. That is the piece of this forecast that separates it from a typical severe weather event. What forecasters are tracking is not a storm system that will fire, roll through, and collapse. What they are watching is a multi-day reload cycle, an atmospheric pattern that keeps feeding itself, keeps generating new rounds of severe weather, keeps coming back. The Storm Prediction Center is not just tracking storms. They are tracking a pattern that refuses to shut down. And the nighttime window is already flagged. Already, In the forecast discussions being circulated among meteorologists, there is specific language about a 10 p.m. to 3 a.m. peak risk window, not an afternoon setup that fades by midnight, a storm system that intensifies after dark. We will get into exactly why that matters and why it should concern you more than the daytime storms. But hold that thought. There is also something worth noting about what is already happening while we track the main event. Flooding has already begun in New York. Winter storms are actively burying parts of the northern tier and arriving simultaneously from 93 million miles away. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The point is this: everything about this forecast, the early probability signal, the model agreement, the energy levels, the precision of the timing, points in one direction, and that direction is not toward a minor event that gets cleaned up overnight. This is the opening act of something that will play out across 5 days, across the entire country, in forms that range from tornadic supercells to river flooding, to blizzards, to something that has nothing to do with the weather at all. And this is just day one. Part 2. The mechanics they're not saying out loud. Most weather coverage will tell you a storm is coming. What it won't tell you is why the storm isn't leaving. That's the question sitting underneath every forecast discussion right now, and the answer is in the upper atmosphere, specifically in the behaviour of an upper-level trough that is doing something meteorologists describe as progressive but embedded, which sounds technical and boring until you understand what it actually means for the next 5 days. A trough is a dip in the jet stream, a region of lower pressure in the upper atmosphere that organises storm systems at the surface. In a typical severe weather setup, a trough sweeps through, triggers a round of storms and exits eastward. The instability exhausts itself, the atmosphere recovers. That is the normal cycle. What we are looking at right now is not the normal cycle. This trough is not sweeping through. It is sitting back, ejecting shortwave disturbances, smaller embedded energy packets, one after another, each one acting like a new trigger as it rotates through the base of the system. Think of it like a pitcher who keeps reaching back for another ball. Every time you think the inning is over, there's another delivery. Each ejected disturbance generates a new surface low, a new focus for severe weather, a new round of storm potential. The system is not weakening between rounds, it is reorganizing. And beneath all of this, the Gulf of Mexico is running like a conveyor belt. The moisture transport out of the Gulf right now is continuous and substantial. Warm, humid air is flowing northward in a near-constant stream, replenishing the atmospheric fuel supply that each storm round consumes. This is not unusual in itself. Gulf moisture surges are a standard ingredient in plain severe weather. What is unusual is the persistence. The flow is not pulsing. It is not weakening overnight and recovering the next afternoon. It is running. And every time a new wave ejects from that upper trough, it finds fresh fuel waiting. Then you add the dry line. The dry line is a feature that doesn't get nearly enough attention in public weather communication. It is one of the most powerful storm triggers on the planet, and it is most active right here, right in the central United States, in exactly the kind of setup we are tracking. It is a boundary, sometimes only a few miles wide, between the moist air from the Gulf and the hot, dry air flowing off the elevated terrain of the desert southwest. The contrast across that boundary can be staggering. On one side, dew points in the 60s. On the other side, dew points in the single digits. That is a completely different atmosphere within walking distance, and when that boundary surges east in the afternoon heating cycle, it acts as a forced lift mechanism. Air is literally shoved upward along the boundary, and when you have 3,000 joules per kilogram of CAPE weighting, the results are violent and fast. What makes Friday particularly concerning is a dual forcing setup that meteorologists almost never see this cleanly aligned. The dry line is not just sitting there as the only trigger. A cold front is approaching from the northwest at the same time. When a cold front and a dry line intersect, you get what some forecasters call a triple point, a convergence zone where multiple boundaries meet, where the lift is maximized and the shear is maximized simultaneously. That is a tornado machine. That is the kind of setup that produces long-track, high-end tornadoes, not just brief spin-ups. Wind shear is the other ingredient that deserves more attention than it gets. Shear is the change in wind speed and direction with height. Storms need shear to rotate. Without it, you get tall, upright thunderstorms that rain and produce lightning and maybe some hail. With strong directional shear, winds shifting from southerly near the surface to southwesterly, in the mid-levels to westerly at the jet stream, Storms can develop the rotating updrafts called mesocyclones that produce tornadoes. The shear profile in this setup strengthens as the system matures. Thursday's environment is significant. Friday's environment is better for tornadic supercells. Saturday and Sunday are not done. The models are in unusual agreement on this. The GFS and the ECMWF, which can diverge dramatically on multi-day setups, are singing from essentially the same sheet. That is a rare and meaningful signal. Model disagreement at day 4 is normal. Model agreement at day 4 on an event of this magnitude is not. There is also a layer of speculation worth acknowledging carefully, because it touches on something that's been circulating in the meteorological community without making it into public forecasts. The Gulf of Mexico has been running anomalously warm this season. Sea surface temperatures in the Western Gulf have been elevated above normal, and while the direct connection between Gulf SST anomalies and individual storm outbreaks is complex and not fully understood, there is growing research suggesting that warmer Gulf waters enhance not just the quantity of moisture transport, but the quality, producing higher dew points, more atmospheric instability, and more aggressive convective initiation. Whether that is a factor in this specific event is a matter of scientific debate. But it is not nothing. What is not speculative is the pattern lock. The atmosphere right now appears to be stuck in a feedback loop. Each round of storms leaves behind surface boundaries, outflow boundaries, cold pools, residual convergence zones that act as seeds for the next round's initiation. The system is not just reloading from above with new wave energy, it is also using the debris of its own previous storms as kindling. The atmosphere is feeding itself. The system is not weakening, it is reorganizing, and the most dangerous phase hasn't even started yet. Part 3. The After Dark Problem. There is a version of this story that most people will never hear about because it will happen while they are asleep. The nighttime severe weather window in this setup is not a footnote. It is arguably the most dangerous part of the entire 5-day sequence, and it is already flagged in the forecast discussions being circulated between meteorologists right now. The window is 10 PM to 3 AM, 5 hours, in the dark. Let's talk about why storms don't simply go away at night, because that is a deeply held public misunderstanding that costs lives in setups exactly like this one. The common intuition is that storms are driven by daytime heating. The sun warms the ground warms the air rises and creates thunderstorms, and when the sun goes down, the process shuts off. That intuition is correct for ordinary afternoon convection. It is dangerously wrong for organised severe weather in a pattern like this one. What happens after sunset in a strongly forced setup, and this is strongly forced, driven by that upper level trough, by the dry line, by the Gulf moisture, is that the low-level jet intensifies. The low-level jet is a ribbon of fast-moving air in the lower atmosphere, typically peaking between 2,000 and 5,000 feet above the surface. During the day, friction from the surface slows it down. After sunset, as the boundary layer decouples and the surface friction layer collapses, that jet accelerates. Wind speeds increase. The directional shear profile, already favourable, improves. The rotation potential for any supercell still alive at 10 PM actually increases, not decreases after dark. In other words, the storms do not weaken when the sun goes down. In this setup, they may strengthen. Now add the human factor, and the picture becomes genuinely grim. Warning response rates at night are a fraction of what they are during the day. People are asleep, phones may be silenced, weather radios may not be on. The instinct to seek shelter when you see a dark, greenish sky bearing down on you simply does not function when you cannot see anything. The visual cues that trigger protective behaviour in daylight, the rotating wall cloud, the lowering beneath the storm, the obvious rotation, are invisible at 2 AM. You're entirely dependent on official warnings, and you have to actually receive them and wake up and act on them in the minutes available. There is also a radar problem. Radar at long distances cannot see close to the ground. The farther a storm is from the radar site, the higher the radar beam is elevated by the time it reaches the storm. This means that low-level rotation, the rotation closest to the ground, where tornadoes actually form, may not be detected by radar until the storm is much closer to the radar site. At night, when visual confirmation is impossible, this gap in radar coverage can mean the difference between a warning issued with several minutes of lead time and a warning issued after a tornado is already on the ground. The geographic corridor of highest concern for this overnight window runs through Oklahoma, Kansas, and North Texas, a region that is no stranger to tornadoes, but that also has substantial rural populations and a history of nighttime tornado fatalities. And the storm mode transition is worth tracking carefully here, because discrete supercells, individual, organised rotating storms, are the most tornado efficient but also the most manageable from a warning perspective. As the night progresses, the convective mode often shifts, storms cluster. They merge into larger systems where the rotation becomes embedded and harder to identify on radar. You can have a significant tornado embedded in a squall line at midnight and not know it until the damage survey the next morning. There is also the fatigue factor. By the time the overnight window opens, day one storms will already have occurred. People who spent Wednesday afternoon watching storm coverage, who may have sheltered or evacuated, who are already on edge, they will be tired. Their vigilance will be lower, and that is exactly when the atmosphere may be delivering its most dangerous punch. This is when storms become harder to track and easier to miss. And while this unfolds overnight, something else is already breaking in another part of the country, something that has nothing to do with supercells or drylines, but that is being driven by the same atmospheric engine. Part 4. The first signs are already breaking. The main event is still days away. The atmosphere apparently did not get that memo either. Active severe thunderstorm watches have already been issued. Storm reports are already coming in from across the plains and into the Midwest. Hail across Texas, wind damage being logged, early severe activity flagging across Ohio. These are not the storms people will remember. These are the opening moves, and to understand why they matter, you have to understand something about how multi-day severe weather outbreaks actually work. The first storms in a sequence like this are not just storms. They are the system introducing itself. They are the atmosphere warming up. But they are also doing something that most weather coverage skips entirely. They are conditioning the atmosphere for what comes next. Every thunderstorm that fires leaves something behind. An outflow boundary, a pool of cold, stable air spreading outward from the storm's downdraft. A surface convergence zone where the outflow meets the ambient environmental flow. A moisture boundary that can act as a focal point for the next round of storm initiation. The early storms are, in a very real sense, setting the table for the later ones. This is called atmospheric priming, and it is one of the reasons why major multi-day outbreaks are often worse on day 2 or day 3 than on day 1. The environment has been modified, the triggers have multiplied. The boundaries left behind by the first round of storms become the ignition zones for the second, which leaves more boundaries for the third. The system builds on itself. The early hail cores already being reported confirm something important about the updraft strength in this setup. Large hail requires violent, sustained vertical motion, a column of air moving upward fast enough to suspend large ice particles while they grow. When you see baseball-sized hail reports, and those are already on the table, you are looking at updrafts of extreme intensity. That same updraft strength is what produces the rotation that leads to tornadoes. The early storm reports are telling forecasters that the atmospheric energy is not theoretical. It is real, it is already being expressed, and warning clusters are already beginning to form. The system is warming up. But the storms are only one expression of something much larger, a compound event of a kind that forecasters and climate scientists rarely get to watch unfold in real time. Because right now, while supercells are firing in Texas and storm spotters are logging their first reports of the season, 8 rivers are overflowing their banks in western New York, Montana is being buried under a foot of snow, grassland fires are consuming parts of Nebraska, and something arrived from space that has nothing to do with any of it, and everything to do with all of it. Part 5. The Rolling Outbreak Timeline. If you were to draw the next 5 days on a map and watch the threat zone shift, you would not see what most people expect. You would not see a storm system arrive and exit. You would see a target that moves while the energy stays exactly where it is. Wednesday evening belongs to the plains. Discrete supercells fire along the dryline as the boundary surges east in the afternoon heating cycle, and the environmental winds align into the classic tornadic shear profile. These are the storms capable of EF2 plus tornadoes, baseball-sized hail, and wind gusts to 75 miles per hour. The target area runs from central Oklahoma northward into central Kansas, with the highest tornado probability concentrated in the corridor where the dry line, the low-level jet, and the instability axis all overlap. Initiation is expected between 6 and 9 p.m. local time, that 3-hour window the SPC has already identified. By 10 p.m, those storms are either evolving into the dangerous overnight scenario we've already discussed, or they are organising into a squall line and pushing east. Either way, they are not done. Thursday's story shifts north and east, and the hazard character changes. The primary threat Thursday is not discrete supercells, it is a powerful wind event as the system's cold front accelerates eastward and a squall line organises ahead of it. Widespread damaging winds, 60 to 70 miles per hour, spread across the Midwest. Tornadoes remain possible along the line, but the greatest swathe of damage Thursday comes from straight-line winds. Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana, all inside the risk zone. And because a squall line can span hundreds of miles of front, the duration of the threat is prolonged. This is not a discrete supercell that passes in 30 minutes. This is hours of gusty, damaging conditions. Then comes Friday, and Friday is the pivot point. Friday is when the dual forcing setup, the dry line and the approaching cold front converging simultaneously, creates the scenario that has forecasters using phrases they reserve for setups they genuinely respect. The instability on Friday is higher than Wednesday. The shear on Friday is better organised than Thursday. The model consensus on Friday is stronger than any other day in the sequence. The SPC's 15% probability flag was issued for Friday, not Wednesday, not Thursday, Friday. Because Friday is when everything that has been building since the beginning of the week arrives at the same place at the same time, a moderate risk upgrade for Friday is not guaranteed. Nothing at day 4 is guaranteed, but it is explicitly on the table in forecast discussions. Moderate risk events are rare. They occur roughly 15 to 20 days per year across the entire country. When one is being actively discussed 4 days in advance, that is the atmosphere sending a message that is very difficult to misread. The weekend does not offer the relief that weekends in April are supposed to offer. Saturday extends the severe threat southward into Texas and Louisiana as the system's southern flank remains active and the remnant Gulf moisture continues feeding the environment. Sunday's attention shifts to the East Coast, where the same system's precipitation shield, now fully evolved and expansive, begins impacting a densely populated corridor from the mid-Atlantic into New England. Not severe weather necessarily on Sunday, but a system that has been generating significant convective energy for 4 days does not simply become benign. It delivers its final act, 5 days, multiple storm modes, a threat zone that shifts but never truly closes. The target moves, the energy doesn't. And while all of that is unfolding across the centre of the country, something entirely different is happening to the east, something that has been overshadowed by the tornado coverage, but that is affecting hundreds of thousands of people right now, and is being driven by the exact same atmospheric engine. Part 6. Western New York flooding. 8 rivers, not one river flooding, and the surrounding area dealing with overflow. 8 rivers simultaneously in western New York crossing flood stage or moving toward it. That is not a flash flood event. That is a regional hydrologic response to a moisture loading event of unusual scale, and it is happening right now, largely invisible to national weather coverage because supercell thunderstorms and possible tornadoes make for better television than rivers quietly overflowing their banks. The rivers involved include Tonawanda Creek, Buffalo Creek, and several of their tributaries, waterways that drain large portions of the agricultural and suburban landscape of western New York. These are not small streams. These are established river systems with defined flood stages that emergency managers track carefully, because when they exceed those stages, real things happen. Roads close, basements flood, parks that sit in floodplains become lakes. Low-lying residential areas that never expected water now have it, and it doesn't leave quickly. The rainfall totals driving this are not apocalyptic in isolation. 1 to 2.5 inches, with locally higher amounts in spots. But those numbers assume soil that can absorb moisture, and the soil in western New York right now cannot. It has been saturated by prior rainfall events earlier in the season, and saturated soil does not absorb additional precipitation, it redirects it. The water that falls runs off almost immediately into streams, which run into rivers, which are already carrying elevated flow. The scientific term for this is runoff amplification, and the practical result is that a rainfall event that would be unremarkable on dry soil becomes a significant flood event on pre-saturated ground. What is happening in western New York is not separate from the 5-day severe weather outbreak unfolding to the west and south. It is the moisture side expression of the same system. The same Gulf moisture plume that is feeding 3,000 Joule Cape values into the plane's severe weather environment is delivering persistent heavy precipitation to the Great Lakes region as it is lifted by the terrain and intercepted by the circulation. You cannot separate the western New York flooding from the Oklahoma tornadoes. They are coming from the same place. They are being generated by the same engine. This is the point that gets lost in fragmented weather coverage, where one team covers severe weather and another covers flooding, and they never quite connect the picture. The scale of this event is only visible when you look at it as one system expressing itself in multiple forms simultaneously. The flooding in New York is not a separate story. It is the same story told in a different language. Flood watches and warnings are active. Emergency managers are monitoring the river gauges, and the rivers are still rising. That multi-system, multi-form character of this event becomes even more obvious when you look at what is happening on the cold side of the same trough, where instead of rain and flooding, the precipitation is falling as snow, and a lot of it. Part 7. Winter storms in the north. While tornadoes are being discussed in Oklahoma and rivers are rising in New York, Montana is disappearing under snow. The same upper-level trough that is energizing the severe weather outbreak in the south is pulling Arctic air southward on its backside and generating significant winter weather across the northern tier. Montana and Wyoming are looking at 12 or more inches of snowfall, with wind gusts approaching 40 miles per hour. Blizzard category conditions that are impacting travel, infrastructure, and agricultural operations that were, just days ago, beginning to thaw into early spring. North Dakota and Minnesota are not being spared, with 4 to 7 inches of snow expected across portions of both states. These are not trivial snowfall events. In April, when much of the country has already mentally moved past winter, these amounts catch communities in transition. Snowplows may be partially decommissioned, winter preparedness reflexes are dulled, and the populations most vulnerable to weather-related illness and exposure may have already made decisions based on the assumption that winter is done. It is not done. And here is what that tells you about the scale of what we are tracking. This is the same storm. The snow in Billings and the tornadoes in Tulsa and the flooding in Buffalo, they're all outputs of the same atmospheric engine, the same upper-level trough driving cold air south on one side while pulling Gulf moisture north on the other. The contrast at the centre of that system is where the severe weather lives. The bookends are winter on one side and flooding on the other. This is not 3 separate weather stories. It is one story told in 3 simultaneous languages. That singular engine, running at full power across the width of a continent, is also doing something on its dry western flank that adds a 4th and contradictory chapter. Part 8. Fire weather escalation. The plains right now are on fire. Grassland fires are burning across Nebraska, and the fire weather conditions being generated by this same atmospheric system are not improving. The western flank of the trough, the region between the moist air to the east and the winter storm to the north, is a zone of extreme dryness and wind. Texas and New Mexico are seeing wind gust potential up to 70 miles per hour in fire-prone areas where drought has already done the preparatory work of desiccating the vegetation to near-critical fuel moisture levels. The recipe for catastrophic fire weather is not complicated. You need dry air, you need wind, and you need fuel. All 3 are present. The dry line, which acts as the trigger for severe thunderstorms on its moist side, acts as the western boundary of this fire weather zone. The same boundary that generates violent storms to the east is the edge of dangerous fire conditions to the west. There is also a paradox worth noting here, because the atmosphere in this event is producing both drought-related fire danger and flood-producing rainfall within a few hundred miles of each other simultaneously. The drought-hardened soil in the fire zones carries an additional risk that most people don't think about. When rain eventually reaches soil that has become severely dried and hydrophobic, water cannot penetrate. The ground repels moisture rather than absorbing it, and the result can be flash flooding on terrain that has been burning. The same storm system that generates fire weather this week may generate flash flooding on the same burned areas later. This is the drought-to-flood paradox, and it is one more expression of the same pattern, a system capable of producing every category of extreme weather simultaneously in different places from the same source. That source, that self-reinforcing multi-day atmospheric engine, is the story. And right now, that engine is running at full capacity across every time zone in the contiguous United States. Which brings us to something the storm reports and river gauge readings cannot fully capture: the sheer scale of the national response required to manage all of it at once. Part 9. National Alert Saturation. There are more than 300 active weather alerts across the United States right now. Read that sentence again, 300. Simultaneously. Flood warnings in New York, winter storm warnings in Montana, severe thunderstorm watches in Texas, red flag warnings in Nebraska and New Mexico, winter weather advisories across the Dakotas and Minnesota. The National Weather Alert map, if you pull it up right now, does not show isolated pockets of activity. It shows a country that is almost entirely covered. New York, Texas, Montana, and Ohio are among the states with the highest alert density, which is remarkable not just for the volume but for the variety. These are not the same alert type repeated across a region. These are fundamentally different hazard categories active simultaneously in different parts of the same country, all being driven by the same atmospheric system expressing itself in different forms. The National Weather Service and its local offices around the country are each managing their piece of this event, and the coordination required across that many simultaneous hazard zones is staggering. Here is what that actually looks like in operational terms. Emergency managers at the county level are tracking their specific hazard, flood stage on the local creek, or the tornado watch that just dropped for their county, or the winter storm that is closing roads into their community. But those county-level managers are also competing for the same state and federal resources, with dozens of other counties facing different emergencies at the same time. A state emergency management director in a state like Texas is simultaneously managing fire weather responses in the west, flood responses in the east, and severe thunderstorm responses in between on the same day. The resource allocation challenge is not trivial. There is also a communication problem that is easy to overlook. Weather alert systems work on the principle of specificity. A tornado warning is urgent and specific, and it triggers immediate behavioral response. A winter storm warning is significant, but it triggers a different, slower response: stock up, stay home, don't drive. A flood warning triggers yet another response: move to higher ground, don't cross flooded roads. When all three types of alerts are active simultaneously, the public, which does not have the cognitive bandwidth to process three simultaneous emergency protocols, begins to struggle. Alert fatigue is real. It has been documented in emergency management research. When warnings become constant background noise, their effectiveness degrades. People begin to filter them, and when the genuinely catastrophic alert arrives in a sea of 300 others, the signal-to-noise ratio has already been compromised. That saturation, that system-level strain across every tier of the emergency response ecosystem, is itself a hazard. It is not the wind or the water or the fire. It is the capacity of human institutions to process and respond to all of them at once. And 300 active alerts is a stress test of that capacity in real time. And while all of this is being managed on the ground, something else arrived. Not from the Gulf of Mexico, not from an upper-level trough, from the sun, 93 million miles away, and it arrived right in the middle of all of this. Part 10. The CME has arrived. While forecasters were busy tracking supercells and river gauges, NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center was tracking something coming from a completely different direction. The CME, the coronal mass ejection, has arrived. Not approaching, arrived. The event originated from region 4405 on the solar surface, which produced an X 1.4 class solar flare, one of the strongest flare categories that exists. The ejected plasma travelled at roughly 1800 kilometers per second, which sounds fast until you realize it still took days to cross the distance between the Sun and Earth. It is now interacting with Earth's magnetosphere, and NOAA has confirmed a G2 geomagnetic storm, the second level on a 5-level scale, significant enough to be consequential in practical terms. The KP index, the Planetary Geomagnetic Activity Index, is expected to reach 6 or above. For context, a KP of 5 is the threshold for storm conditions. A KP of 6 means aurora visible as far south as Iowa and Oregon under good viewing conditions, which means that right now, in the middle of this 5-day severe weather siege, people in the central United States might look out their windows on a clear night and see the northern lights over tornado country. Let's be precise about what this means, because this is a topic that tends to attract either dismissal or exaggeration, and neither serves you well. A G2 geomagnetic storm does not affect the weather. There is no established mechanism by which a coronal mass ejection amplifies thunderstorm activity or influences precipitation. The severe weather outbreak is not being caused by, triggered by, or enhanced by the CME. Those are two independent physical systems with separate driving mechanisms, and conflating them would be a disservice to the science. What a G2 storm does affect is infrastructure and technology. The electron flux from this event has been elevated for more than 10 days. Satellite charging is a documented risk. The energetic particles impacting satellites in low Earth orbit can deposit electrical charge on satellite surfaces, potentially disrupting electronics or shortening operational lifespans. For the vast majority of people, that is an abstraction. But here is where this connects back to the 5-day siege in a very concrete way. This same CME and its associated energetic particle flux can degrade high-frequency radio communication, HF radio. An HF radio is not some outdated technology that nobody uses. Storm spotters use it. Amateur radio operators embedded in the severe weather reporting network across the Central Plains use it. Emergency management agencies in rural areas use it as a backup when cell networks are overwhelmed or damaged. During a major severe weather outbreak, the HF radio network is not decorative. It is functional infrastructure. A G2 geomagnetic storm can produce R1 to R2 radio blackouts on the sunlit side of Earth. The level of disruption is not guaranteed, and no confirmed communication failures have been reported yet. But the question worth sitting with is, what happens to the storm spotter and emergency communication network during the most active phase of a 5-day outbreak if that network's radio backbone is simultaneously being stressed by solar activity? We do not know the answer yet, but the question is not hypothetical. Part 11. The communications question. Forecasters manage severe weather events with information. That is the foundation of the entire system. They receive storm spotter reports from trained volunteers positioned in the field, watching the sky in real time. They share radar observations across a network of Doppler sites that blankets the country. They relay warnings to the public through every channel available: sirens, phones, broadcast alerts, digital platforms. They coordinate with emergency managers at the county, state, and federal level, making sure the right resources are moving toward the right places before the worst arrives. The entire apparatus is built on communication, and that communication has layers that most people never think about until one of them fails. The outermost layer is the one you interact with: the phone alert, the television crawl, the outdoor siren. Beneath that is the digital network infrastructure, the servers and fiber lines and data pipelines that carry radar imagery and model output, and warning polygons from forecasting offices to emergency managers to the public. Beneath that are the cell towers, which can fail under high wind, lose power during prolonged outages, or become saturated when an entire region reaches for their phones simultaneously during a tornado warning. Beneath that are the satellite links, more resilient than cell towers, but not invulnerable, and particularly sensitive to the kind of space weather environment currently developing above the planet. And underneath all of it, functioning as the system's last line of redundancy when every other layer has been compromised, is the HF radio backbone, high-frequency radio, the technology that has been moving information across continents since before satellites existed, and that still forms the connective tissue of storm spotter networks across the Central Plains. HF radio propagation works because of the ionosphere, a layer of the upper atmosphere, roughly 60 to 1,000 kilometers above the surface, where solar radiation ionizes gas molecules and creates a region that can reflect radio waves back toward Earth. This reflection is what allows HF signals to travel far beyond the horizon, bouncing between the ionosphere and the ground, covering hundreds or thousands of miles with relatively low power. It is elegant, reliable, and almost entirely dependent on the ionosphere behaving itself, and the ionosphere is profoundly sensitive to solar activity. When a coronal mass ejection arrives and energetic particles begin interacting with the upper atmosphere, the ionosphere does not remain the calm, reflective layer that HF radio depends on. It becomes turbulent. In certain conditions, it becomes absorptive. Instead of reflecting radio waves back toward Earth, it absorbs them. The signal goes up and does not come back. the communication link degrades, weakens, and in significant events disappears entirely. This is called a radio blackout, and it is classified on a scale from R1 to R5, with R1 representing minor degradation and R5 representing complete HF blackout on the sunlit side of the planet. This is not a theoretical vulnerability. This is not a scenario that scientists have modelled but never observed. Radio blackouts during significant solar events are documented, measured, and well understood. The X-1.4 flare that launched this particular coronal mass ejection toward Earth is well within the range of events that have produced R1 and R2 radio blackouts in the past. The current risk assessment from NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center places this event in exactly that range, R1 to R2, minor to moderate blackout potential, real even if the precise impact will only be confirmed as the event unfolds in real time because the ionosphere is not a controlled laboratory, and solar storms do not follow scripts. Now take that risk and place it alongside the scenario already developing on the ground, because this is where the two stories, the atmospheric one and the solar one, stop being parallel and start becoming entangled in ways that matter operationally. It is late Wednesday evening. The sun has been down for hours. The low-level jet has accelerated as it does after sunset in this kind of strongly forced atmospheric setup. Discrete supercells are firing across the central plains in the nighttime window, the most dangerous phase of this entire 5-day sequence. The one we have already established produces tornadoes that are harder to detect, harder to warn for, and harder for the public to respond to. Storm spotters are deployed. These are trained volunteers, positioned in vehicles across tornado-prone counties, watching the sky, reporting what they see, filling in the gaps that radar cannot cover on its own. The warning coordination network is running at full capacity. Forecasters in local offices are tracking multiple cells simultaneously, issuing warnings, updating the public, coordinating with emergency managers. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And the HF radio bands that form the backbone of the spotter reporting system are being stressed by a G2 geomagnetic storm arriving at precisely the same time. There are no confirmed disruptions as of this moment. There is no evidence yet that spotters are losing communication, that warning coordination is being compromised, that the operational chain is breaking down in any measurable way. That needs to be stated clearly, because the purpose here is not alarm, the purpose is accuracy. And the accurate picture of what is happening right now includes two independent systems, one atmospheric, one solar, peaking simultaneously, creating an operational environment that is more complex than either system would create on its own. Emergency response capacity is finite. This is not a philosophical observation. It is a logistical reality. There are only so many forecasters on shift, only so many emergency managers monitoring their counties, only so many storm spotters in the field, only so many channels of communication available to carry the information that keeps the warning system functioning. When those finite resources are asked to manage one significant event, the system handles it. That is what the system was built for. When those same finite resources are asked to manage two significant events simultaneously, one on the ground, one arriving from space, neither event receives the complete undivided attention it would command if it arrived alone. Attention, like bandwidth, is a resource that gets divided when demand exceeds supply. This is worth sitting with, because it describes something important about how compound events are dangerous in ways that go beyond the direct physical impacts of any individual hazard. The tornado does not become stronger because there is a geomagnetic storm overhead. The flooding river does not rise faster because Montana is simultaneously buried in snow. The direct physical hazards are independent. But the human systems built to respond to those hazards are not independent of each other. They share personnel, they share infrastructure, they share attention, and when multiple hazards compete for those shared resources simultaneously, the efficiency of the response to each individual hazard is reduced, not because the people involved are failing, but because the demand has exceeded what any finite system can deliver at full capacity. That is the real story of what is happening this week, not one crisis. A convergence of multiple independent crises arriving at the same moment, each one individually within the range of what the system is designed to handle, but collectively representing a load that tests the outer edges of what those systems were built for. The severe weather outbreak is manageable. The geomagnetic storm is manageable. The flooding in New York is manageable. The blizzard in Montana is manageable. The fire weather in Nebraska is manageable. All of them at once, competing for the same finite pool of forecaster attention, emergency management resources, communication infrastructure, and public awareness. That is a different calculation entirely. There is a term in systems engineering for what happens when multiple independent failure modes occur simultaneously in a complex system. It is called a coincident load event. The individual components are rated to handle their individual loads. What they are not always rated to handle is all of those loads arriving together, because the designers of those components were optimizing for realistic scenarios, not worst-case convergences. The National Emergency Response System is extraordinarily well designed, but it was designed by people who understood the normal distribution of bad days. This week is not a normal distribution. And that convergence, that compounding, layering, simultaneous arrival of independent systems at their peak is about to get one more layer added to it. Part 12. The timing convergence. Let us take a step back and look at what is happening right now, simultaneously, on this single Wednesday in early April. Not the forecast models, not the probability discussions circulating between meteorological offices, not the KP index readings or the river gauge measurements or the radar returns, just the raw inventory of what is actually occurring on this one day, on this one planet. Because when you lay it all out together and let the full picture register, something shifts in how it feels. Supercells are firing across the southern plains in the opening act of a 5-day severe weather siege that forecasters have been unusually vocal about days in advance. 8 rivers are flooding in western New York, quietly and without the dramatic visual language of rotating storms, just water climbing steadily through neighborhoods and across roads in a region that did not expect this week to look like this. Blizzard conditions are descending on Montana and Wyoming, closing highways, grounding flights, burying the first tentative signs of spring under a foot of snow that arrived without much national attention, because blizzards in the northern tier in April do not typically break through a news cycle already saturated with tornado coverage. Grassland fires are burning across Nebraska, driven by the same powerful dry winds that form the western edge of the same atmospheric system, generating supercells several hundred miles to the southeast. A G2 geomagnetic storm from an X 1.4 solar flare is interacting with Earth's magnetosphere, compressing it on the dayside, expanding the aurora oval toward latitudes that rarely see it, and quietly stressing the radio infrastructure that the severe weather warning network depends on to function. 300 active weather alerts are blanketing the country from coast to coast, and in a few hours, 4 astronauts are scheduled to leave the planet entirely. Take a moment with that list, not quickly. Let each item land before moving to the next, because the temptation when reading a list like that is to process it at speed, to let the items blur together into a general impression of a bad week. Resist that temptation. Each of those lines represents a distinct physical event with its own geography, its own affected population, its own required institutional response, its own human cost. Each of those things individually is a story, a complete self-contained story with its own causes and consequences and the people living inside them. Each has happened before, in isolation, and been managed by the systems designed to handle it. A major severe weather outbreak managed. A regional flooding event managed. A blizzard across the northern tier managed. A fire weather emergency in the plains managed. A moderate geomagnetic storm managed. A crewed spaceflight mission managed and celebrated. The probability of any single one of them occurring on a given April day is not vanishingly small. These are not individually exotic events. They are within the range of what April in the United States can produce. But the probability of all of them occurring simultaneously, of the severe outbreak and the flooding and the blizzard and the fire weather and the geomagnetic storm and the human spaceflight mission, all peaking within the same 72-hour window, is the kind of number that statisticians write papers about. Not because the combination is physically impossible, because it is statistically improbable enough that when it actually happens, it demands a different category of attention than any individual component would receive on its own. This is what researchers who study complex environmental systems call a compound event. The terminology is precise and deliberate. A compound event is not simply a bad week or an unfortunate coincidence. It is a specific concept in the scientific literature, the simultaneous or closely sequential occurrence of multiple hazardous conditions that interact in ways that amplify their combined impact on human systems beyond what any single hazard would produce in isolation. Not a storm, not a disaster, a confluence. Multiple independent systems, each driven by its own physics, each developing along its own timeline, arriving at the same moment in a way that creates combined stress on infrastructure, emergency response capacity, public attention, and institutional resources that none of them would generate alone. The severe weather system and the geomagnetic storm are causally unrelated. There is no physical mechanism connecting a coronal mass ejection to supercell thunderstorm development over the southern plains. The flooding in New York and the fires in Nebraska share a common atmospheric parent, the same trough driving moisture northeast on one side and dry winds southwest on the other, but they are not communicating with each other in any meaningful operational sense. The blizzard in Montana has no awareness of the tornadoes being warned for in Oklahoma, even though both are outputs of the same large-scale circulation pattern, expressing itself in different forms at different latitudes. These are independent physical systems, each obeying its own governing equations, each entirely indifferent to the existence of the others. But they are all happening at once, and the systems built to respond to them, the National Weather Service, FEMA, state emergency managers, county emergency coordinators, local fire departments, amateur radio networks, power grid operators, hospital emergency departments preparing for potential mass casualty events, transportation agencies rerouting around flooded roads and snow-closed passes, are not independent of each other. They share personnel, they share funding streams, they share communication infrastructure, they share the finite and non-renewable resource of human attention. And when multiple hazards arrive simultaneously and compete for those shared resources, the response to each individual hazard is degraded, not because the people involved are failing at their jobs, but because the combined demand has exceeded what any finite system can deliver at full efficiency. Compound events are not new. History offers precedents that shaped how we think about disaster response. The autumn of 1993 produced a remarkable alignment of atmospheric extremes across the United States that stressed federal and state response systems in ways that individual events had not previously exposed. The spring of 2011 brought a tornado outbreak of historic scale. The April 27th outbreak that generated more than 300 tornadoes in a single day across the Deep South, occurring in close temporal proximity to catastrophic flooding along the Mississippi River system, a sequence that required the simultaneous deployment of federal disaster resources across multiple states facing completely different hazard types, and that revealed significant gaps in multi-hazard coordination doctrine that emergency managers have been working to address ever since. But those precedents were largely sequential. One acute phase peaked. The immediate response was mounted, and then the next crisis deepened as the first began to stabilize. The flooding along the Mississippi crested gradually as the tornado response was transitioning from search and rescue to recovery. The system had time, not much, but some, to redirect finite resources from one acute demand to the next. The events were adjacent. They overlapped at the edges. They tested the system's capacity to pivot. What is unusual about this week is not the individual magnitude of any single component. It is the simultaneity. Not one after another with breathing room in between. All of them at once, fully active, all demanding response, all competing for the same pool of resources at the same moment. The severe weather outbreak is not waiting for the flooding response to stand down before escalating. The geomagnetic storm did not schedule its arrival for after the blizzard response concluded. The fires in Nebraska are not pausing while the tornado warnings are being issued in Oklahoma. Everything is live. Everything is now. And the systems built to handle each of those things individually are being asked simultaneously to handle all of them. And it would be easy, understandably, forgivably, humanly easy, to look at this convergence and feel that it must mean something beyond the physics, that events of this scale and this simultaneity cannot merely be coincidences, that the universe is communicating something. The human brain is extraordinarily well designed to find patterns, to impose narrative structure on sequences of events, to experience the powerful feeling that coincidences at this scale are not really coincidences at all. That capacity for pattern recognition is not a flaw. It is one of the most sophisticated features of human cognition, and for most of our species' history it was essential to survival. The ability to look at apparently unrelated events and ask whether they might be connected, Whether the drought and the animal behavior and the sky color might all be pointing toward the same coming storm is the cognitive foundation of both science and storytelling. But here is the honest, scientifically grounded answer, offered without condescension and without apology. The convergence can be coincidental. The CME did not cause the tornadoes. The tornadoes did not trigger the flooding. The flooding did not ignite the fires. The fires did not pull the blizzard southward. These are independent physical systems, governed by independent physical laws, expressing their individual dynamics at the same moment without any awareness of or causal relationship to each other. The universe does not send messages through weather events and solar storms and spaceflight schedules. It operates according to physics. And sometimes, at the outer edges of the probability distribution, those operations overlap in ways that feel cosmically significant, because we are meaning-making creatures living inside a moment that the universe generated without any reference to us at all. Individually, any of them would be normal. Together, they are unusual. And that distinction, normal events, unusual alignment, is not a deflation of the significance of this week. It is actually a more interesting framing, because it raises a question that the physics alone cannot answer. If compound events like this are becoming more frequent, if the probability of these alignments is shifting, then something in the underlying conditions is changing, and that something is worth paying attention to with more rigor than any single storm deserves. And right in the middle of this convergence, as all of these systems are peaking at once, and 300 alerts blanket the country, and rivers rise and fires burn and supercells rotate in the dark over the central plains, 4 human beings are strapping themselves into a rocket, running their final checklists with the calm professionalism of people who have trained for years for exactly this moment, and pointing themselves at the moon. They are leaving. And from where they are going, none of this will be visible. Just a small, blue, quietly complicated world receding behind them into the dark. Part 13, Artemis II launch. 54 years. Sit with that number for a moment because it is easy to say and genuinely difficult to absorb. 54 years since a human being left the neighbourhood of Earth and travelled to another world. 54 years since the last boot print was pressed into lunar regolith, since the last human hand touched a surface that was not Earth or an orbital construction built by Earth. To put that into generational terms, everyone alive today under the age of 54 was born into a world where human beings had already stopped going to the moon. For most of humanity currently drawing breath, the era of humans travelling beyond Earth orbit is not a living memory. It is history. It is something that happened before they arrived. The last time it happened, the crew of Apollo 17, Commander Eugene Cernan, Lunar Module pilot Harrison Schmitt, and Command Module pilot Ronald Evans departed the lunar surface on December 14, 1972. Cernan was the last human being to walk on the moon, and before he climbed the ladder back into the lunar module, he spoke words that have carried a particular weight ever since. He said that he believed humanity's record of departure would not be too long into the future. He was wrong about the timeline, as it turned out. Not about the eventual return, perhaps, but certainly about how long it would take. He expected years. It has been more than 5 decades. Since then, the human spaceflight program has done extraordinary things that should not be minimized. Humans have lived continuously aboard the International Space Station since November of 2000, an unbroken chain of human presence in low Earth orbit spanning nearly 25 years. Robotic missions have reached every planet in the solar system, landed on Mars multiple times, flown through the atmospheres of gas giants, and sent 2 spacecraft, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, beyond the heliopause into interstellar space. The scientific return from those 5 decades of robotic exploration has been genuinely staggering. We know incomparably more about our solar system today than we did when Cernan climbed that ladder, but no human being has travelled beyond low Earth orbit in more than half a century. That specific achievement, leaving the protective bubble of Earth's magnetic field, crossing the 250,000 miles of cislunar space, arriving at another world, has not been repeated until today. The Artemis II crew is scheduled to launch in the midst of everything we have been tracking this week, and the biographical details of who these 4 people are deserve more than a passing mention, because they represent something deliberate and meaningful about what this mission is intended to signal. Commander Reed Wiseman, a Navy test pilot and veteran NASA astronaut, will lead the mission. Pilot Victor Glover, also a Navy test pilot, becomes the first person of colour to travel beyond Earth orbit, a milestone that arrives 54 years after Apollo and carries its own weight of history. Mission specialist Christina Koch, who holds the record for the longest single spaceflight by a woman, will become the first woman to travel beyond Earth orbit in the history of human spaceflight, another milestone that, when you consider that women have been part of the astronaut corps since 1978, arrives considerably later than it should have, but arrives nonetheless. And mission specialist Jeremy Hansen of the Canadian Space Agency becomes the first non-American to fly to the Moon, a reflection of the international partnership architecture that the Artemis program is built on. 4 people, 4 historical firsts or near firsts compressed into a single crew manifest. Departing Earth at a moment when the Earth they are leaving is, by almost any measure, having a complicated week. NASA's current launch probability sits at 80% favourable. That number is generated by meteorologists at the Kennedy Space Center Weather Office, and it accounts for local launch weather conditions at the Florida launch site, cloud cover, lightning potential, wind shear at altitude, not the severe weather unfolding across the central United States, which is sufficiently distant to be meteorologically irrelevant to the launch mechanics. You can have a tornado warned for in Oklahoma and perfectly acceptable launch weather in Florida simultaneously, and this week, that is precisely what is happening. The geomagnetic storm is an entirely different calculation, and it is the one that NASA's mission planners and space weather liaisons have been watching most carefully. NASA has established specific radiation and geomagnetic activity thresholds above which a crewed lunar mission cannot safely proceed. These thresholds exist because the radiation environment beyond Earth's magnetosphere is not forgiving. Inside the magnetosphere, Earth's magnetic field deflects the majority of energetic particles from the Sun. Outside it, in the cislunar environment where the Artemis II crew will be spending the majority of their mission, that protection largely disappears. Solar energetic particles, the kind produced by X-class flares and accelerated by coronal mass ejections, can deliver significant radiation doses to crew members in that environment with a speed and intensity that mission planners must account for carefully. The X-1.4 flare that produced this CME and the G2 geomagnetic storm now interacting with Earth's magnetosphere were being modelled against NASA's mission safety thresholds in the days leading up to launch. As of the current forecast, the geomagnetic conditions are within acceptable parameters. The elevated particle flux is within the range that mission radiation monitoring systems are designed to track and manage. The mission is a go, but it is worth being precise about what that means. It means the conditions are within the defined acceptable range, not that the conditions are ideal. The crew is launching during an active geomagnetic storm. They are departing during elevated solar particle flux. The same CME that is generating aurora over tornado country in the Central Plains, that is stressing HF radio networks across the warning system, is part of the radiation environment this crew will be moving through on their way to the Moon. NASA calculates accumulated radiation dose for every crewed mission, tracking it in real time against career exposure limits for each astronaut. The timing of this CME is a variable in that calculation. Mission controllers will be monitoring the particle environment continuously. If conditions change, if the geomagnetic storm intensifies beyond current projections, if a subsequent solar event occurs during the mission, the crew has options and protocols. They are not flying blind into this. They are flying informed, with full awareness of the environment and the contingencies built into the mission architecture. That is what 50 years of human spaceflight experience looks like in practice. But the mission is going, and there is something almost philosophically disorienting about sitting with that fact alongside everything else we have been tracking this week. While 300 weather alerts cover the country, while rivers climb their banks in western New York and snow buries Montana, and fires consume Nebraska grasslands and supercells rotate in the dark over the southern plains, 4 human beings are running through their final pre-launch checklists with the methodical calm of people who have spent years training for exactly this moment. They are about to strap themselves into the most powerful rocket currently operational on Earth, riding controlled explosions into an environment that will kill them in seconds without the technology wrapped around them, and then travel 250,000 miles to loop around a world they cannot land on yet and come home. They will be gone. Genuinely, physically gone in a way that almost nothing in modern life prepares us to think about clearly. Not in another city, not on another continent, beyond the magnetosphere, in cislunar space, looking back at a planet that, from their vantage point, will show no evidence of anything we have been discussing. The 300 active weather alerts will be invisible. The tornado warnings will be invisible. The flooding rivers and the blizzard and the fires will be invisible. The geomagnetic storm hammering the magnetosphere will be visible only as the subtle glow of an extended aurora oval draped across the polar regions of a small, round, impossibly blue world suspended in absolute black. From where they are going, it is beautiful. The Earth they leave behind will not look like what we are tracking, and the Earth they return to, roughly 10 days from now, will have moved on from all of this because that is what weather does. It passes. The storms dissipate. The rivers recede. The fires are contained. The geomagnetic storm quiets. The atmosphere recovers its equilibrium and begins building the next pattern. Life continues, as it always does, in the aftermath of weeks that felt from inside them like something unprecedented. But while they are gone, while those 4 human beings are arcing through the silence of cislunar space on the first crewed lunar mission in 54 years, the rest of us are here, on the ground, inside the storm, watching it unfold in real time from inside the only atmosphere any human being has ever called home. And maybe that contrast, the 4 people leaving and the 8 billion staying, is the most honest summary of this particular Wednesday in April that anyone could offer. Part 14. The Psychological Layer. Something shifts when you step back and look at all of this at once, not in the data. The data is what it is: atmospheric measurements, river gauges, radar returns, KP indices, launch weather assessments, storm spotter reports, satellite imagery. None of that changes when you zoom out. The numbers are the numbers. The supercells are rotating whether you're watching them or not. The rivers are rising whether the gauges are being read or not. The geomagnetic storm is compressing the magnetosphere whether anyone is checking the KP index or not. The data does not care about perspective. It just is. What changes when you zoom out is something harder to name, and for that reason, something that serious people are sometimes reluctant to discuss. A feeling of scale. A sense that the world is louder than it usually is, that more things are happening simultaneously than the human mind was designed to hold comfortably in a single frame of attention. A low-grade vertigo that comes not from any single element of the picture, but from the picture itself, from the sheer density of simultaneous activity pressing against the edges of comprehension. That feeling is real. It is not hysteria. It is not the product of too much news consumption or an overactive imagination. It is an accurate perceptual response to a genuinely unusual convergence of events, and it deserves to be examined honestly and carefully, rather than dismissed as sentiment or elevated into prophecy. Both of those responses, the dismissal and the elevation, are ways of avoiding the harder, more interesting work of sitting with the feeling and asking what it is actually telling you. What it is telling you, at the most basic level, is that the week is genuinely unusual, not unprecedented in every individual component, not historically unprecedented as a compound event, but unusual, outside the normal range of day-to-day complexity. A week that will appear as an outlier in whatever dataset you choose to measure it against. That unusualness is real, and acknowledging it is not the same as assigning it cosmic significance. We are watching multiple independent systems peak simultaneously. Severe weather, flooding, blizzard, fire, solar storm, human spaceflight. Each one a legitimate major story in its own right. Each one demanding institutional attention, public awareness, and media coverage that it would fully command on a quiet week. And the instinct, the deeply, anciently human instinct, is to reach for a story that connects them, to find the thread, to feel that events of this magnitude and this simultaneity cannot be coincidental, that there must be a pattern underneath the apparent chaos, that if you could only find the right frame, the right conceptual lens, everything would resolve into coherence and meaning. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We have been since before we had language, before we had science, before we had any framework more sophisticated than the lived experience of surviving in an environment that was trying to kill us with some regularity. Our survival as a species depended on our ability to recognize patterns in noise, to extract signal from chaos, to notice that the behavior of birds before a storm, and the color of the sky at sunset and the movement of animals in the hours before an earthquake all pointed towards something coming. That capacity is not a cognitive bug. It is one of the most sophisticated and successful features in the history of biological evolution. It is the foundation of science, of art, of religion, of every system of meaning that human beings have ever constructed. And that same capacity applied to a week like this one generates a feeling that is almost impossible to resist. The feeling that something is being communicated, that the universe is signaling, that the tornadoes and the flooding rivers and the blizzard and the fires and the solar storm and the moon launch are not independent accidents accumulating by chance, but verses in a single poem that means something if you can only find the right way to read it. Here is what is also true, stated carefully and without condescension, because this is not a simple point even though it can be made briefly. The universe does not signal, it operates. Systems evolve according to physics, not according to narrative logic. The Sun produces coronal mass ejections because of magnetic field dynamics in its corona that have been building over days or weeks in a specific active region, entirely indifferent to what the atmosphere over Oklahoma is doing at the same moment. The atmosphere generates severe weather because of temperature gradients and moisture availability and wind shear profiles that develop, according to fluid dynamics, equations that have no awareness of what is happening in the magnetosphere above them. Rivers flood because rainfall exceeds the absorption capacity of saturated soil, and the resulting runoff exceeds the conveyance capacity of established drainage networks. These are independent processes, running in parallel, occasionally intersecting in time without any causal relationship to each other, and without any awareness of each other whatsoever. The compound event is real. The physical overlap is real. The operational strain is real. The week is genuinely unusual. All of that is true, and none of it requires a connecting narrative to be significant. But the meaning, the sense that this must add up to something beyond the physics, that the convergence is pointing somewhere, that the universe assembled this particular week for a reason, that is a projection that human beings bring to the data. It is not something the data contains. The data contains measurements. The meaning is ours. We make it. We always have. What is worth taking seriously, carefully, rigorously, with the same intellectual honesty that good science requires, is a different and more tractable question. Not whether this week was designed, but whether weeks like this are becoming more common, not connected by cosmic intention, but connected by physical context, connected by the background conditions that make extreme events more or less probable. The Gulf of Mexico is warmer than it was 30 years ago. That is not a projection or a model output or a speculative claim. It is a measurement, confirmed across multiple independent observational datasets, consistent with a multi-decade warming trend in ocean surface temperatures across the Western Atlantic Basin. Warmer ocean water means more evaporation, more atmospheric moisture, higher dew points, more fuel available to the convective systems that produce severe weather outbreaks. The jet stream is more amplified and more persistent in its extreme configurations than historical baselines suggest it should be, a phenomenon that researchers have linked, with growing but not yet definitive confidence, to the differential warming between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes that has been accelerating over the past several decades. A more amplified jet stream produces more extreme temperature contrast between air masses, more persistent blocking patterns, more prolonged severe weather setups of exactly the kind we are watching this week. The fire weather season across the western and central United States is measurably longer than it was a generation ago, more days per year meeting the threshold conditions of low humidity, high wind and dry fuel that produce the kind of rapid spread fire events burning across Nebraska right now. The severe weather season is expanding at both ends of the calendar, more significant tornado outbreaks in February and March, more activity persisting into October and November, in ways that are consistent with the warming trend, but that are difficult to attribute with precision to any single cause. These are documented trends. They are supported by large bodies of peer-reviewed scientific evidence. They are not fringe claims or political positions. They are the outputs of the most rigorous observational and analytical systems that human science has produced. Whether those trends are producing more frequent compound events, more weeks like this one, more moments where multiple independent extremes align in the same narrow window, is an active and genuinely difficult area of research. The honest answer, from the people doing that research, is that we are not sure yet. The data suggests yes. The physical mechanisms that would explain an increasing frequency of compound events are real and documented. The confidence in the trend is growing, The certainty is not yet there. Anyone who tells you otherwise in either direction, either that compound events are definitively becoming more common, or that there is no evidence they are, is overstating what the science currently supports. What we can say with confidence is that this week is unusual, that the convergence happening right now represents something outside the normal range of daily complexity, that the emergency response systems managing it are being tested in ways that isolated events would not produce, that the people living inside that converging system, the family sheltering in their basement in Oklahoma while the tornado warning siren runs outside, the homeowner watching water climb the steps of their front porch in western New York, the rancher watching fire move across their pasture in Nebraska, the traveller stranded on a snow-closed highway in Montana, are experiencing something that the aggregate data, however striking, cannot fully represent. Because the aggregate data describes the system. It does not describe what it feels like to be inside it. This is not, at its core, a data story. The data is the skeleton. But the story is about what happens when the planet decides, for no particular reason rooted in intention or design or cosmic communication, to simply be loud in every register at once, when the atmosphere and the sun and the rivers and the fire and the human ambition to leave this world behind all choose the same week to express themselves at full volume. It is not a message, but it is worth hearing anyway. Part 15. Why won't the atmosphere shut down? Here is the question that keeps appearing in the background of every forecast discussion being circulated right now, often unspoken in the official language of meteorological briefings, sometimes stated directly in the private conversations between forecasters who have been watching this pattern with growing unease. Why won't this atmosphere shut down? It is a deceptively simple question with a genuinely complex answer, and it matters beyond this week. Because if you understand why this pattern keeps reloading, why it refuses to follow the normal arc of a severe weather outbreak, why it keeps finding fuel when it should be exhausting itself, you understand something important not just about the next 5 days, but about the kind of atmospheric behaviour that may become more familiar in the years ahead. Start with what normal looks like, because the deviation only becomes visible against that baseline. A typical severe weather outbreak in the central United States follows a recognisable rhythm. An upper-level trough, a dip in the jet stream, approaches from the west. It interacts with a warm, moist air mass that has been building ahead of it from the Gulf of Mexico. The combination produces severe thunderstorms, sometimes tornadoes, significant hail, damaging winds. The trough moves through, exits to the east, and the air mass behind it, cooler, drier, more stable, floods southward into the region that just experienced the storms. The atmosphere stabilizes, storm potential drops. Forecasters shift from warning operations to damage assessment mode. The environment recovers, sometimes within 24 hours, sometimes over 2 or 3 days, and then begins the slow process of reloading for the next round, which might be days or weeks away. That is the normal rhythm of springtime weather in the central United States. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The atmosphere spends energy, recovers, and spends it again on a schedule that gives emergency management systems time to breathe between acute phases. What we are watching right now does not follow that rhythm, and the reason starts with the upper-level trough itself, which is behaving in a way that experienced meteorologists find atypical and, frankly, worth paying careful attention to. Instead of progressing eastward and dissipating as troughs normally do, this one is acting as a persistent wave generator. It is a structure that repeatedly ejects shortwave energy disturbances, smaller embedded impulses of energy that rotate through the base of the trough and propagate eastward, while the trough itself maintains its position. Think of it as a spinning top that keeps throwing off sparks without losing its rotation. Each ejected shortwave acts as a new trigger for surface weather development. Each one generates a new surface low, a new focus for severe weather, a new round of storm potential. And between ejections, the trough does not weaken significantly. It reorganizes, it waits, and then it throws another one. That persistence is unusual, and it implies something specific about the large-scale atmospheric configuration surrounding the trough. Specifically, it implies blocking. A pattern of anomalously strong high pressure has built to the north and east of the trough, and that blocking high is doing exactly what its name suggests. It is blocking the normal eastward progression of the flow. The trough cannot exit because there is nowhere for it to go. It is, in a sense, trapped between the blocking high downstream and the flow pushing from behind, forced to spin in place and export energy in the form of those repeated shortwave ejections rather than move through and dissipate. Atmospheric blocking is not a minor meteorological curiosity. It is the mechanism behind some of the most extreme and damaging weather events in the historical record. The European heatwave of 2003, which killed an estimated 70,000 people across the continent, was sustained by a blocking high that sat over Central Europe for weeks, redirecting the normal flow and preventing any relief from arriving. The Russian heatwave of 2010, which drove wildfires across millions of acres and contributed to thousands of deaths, was similarly sustained by persistent blocking. Every multi-week drought on record, every extended flood sequence, every anomalously prolonged period of extreme weather has blocking somewhere in its causal chain. The atmosphere gets stuck, and when it gets stuck, extremes amplify. What we're seeing this week is not blocking of that magnitude or duration. This is a 5-day event, not a 5-week catastrophe. But the mechanism is related, and the fact that it is operating at all, that the flow pattern is sufficiently disrupted to prevent normal progression for 5 consecutive days, is worth noting carefully. Beneath that blocked, persistent trough, the Gulf of Mexico is running like an uninterrupted conveyor belt, and this is where the thermal state of the ocean becomes directly relevant to what is happening over land. Water temperature is the fundamental governor of oceanic evaporation. Warmer water evaporates more readily, loading more moisture into the atmosphere above the ocean surface and into the airflow that carries that moisture northward into the continental interior. The western Gulf of Mexico has been running measurably above normal temperatures this season, a thermal anomaly that is documented in buoy measurements and satellite sea surface temperature retrievals, and that is consistent with the broader pattern of Gulf warming that has been observed over the past several decades. The direct attribution from Gulf sea surface temperature anomalies to this specific outbreak is a genuinely complex scientific question that will take months of post-event analysis to address with any rigor. Atmospheric systems are not simple input-output machines, and the causal chain from warmer ocean water to more intense supercells runs through enough intermediate steps that confident attribution requires careful modelling work, not real-time inference. But the physical mechanism is not in dispute. More heat in the ocean means more evaporation. More evaporation means more moisture in the airflow. More moisture in the airflow means more fuel available to the severe weather environment. The Gulf conveyor running warm and continuous this week is not coincidentally correlated with the 3,000 Joule Cape values loading over the plains. It is part of the explanation for them. Then there is the concept of boundary recycling, which sounds like the kind of technical terminology that meteorologists use to impress each other at conferences, but which actually describes something almost elegant in the way it operates. Elegant and, given the context, somewhat unsettling. Every round of thunderstorms leaves something behind when it dissipates. Not just rain and wind and the memory of a warning. It leaves physical imprints on the atmosphere, outflow boundaries where cold air from the storm's downdraft spread outward across the surface, creating sharp temperature discontinuities that can persist for hours or even days. Moisture gradient zones where the storm's inflow carved a boundary between the humid environment ahead and the drier air behind. Convergent zones where multiple airflow streams are forced together at the surface, creating preferred areas of low-level lift that act as initiation points for new convection. These are not abstract theoretical constructs. They are real, measurable features that show up on surface observation networks and that experienced forecasters actively track as they anticipate where the next round of storms will develop. The second wave of storms in this sequence does not have to build its own trigger mechanism from scratch against a blank atmospheric canvas. It finds the triggers left behind by the first wave, the outflow boundaries, the moisture gradients, the convergent zones, already embedded in the surface environment, already positioned and ready to focus new storm development. The third wave finds what the second wave left. Each round of storms is, in a literal and measurable sense, setting the table for the next one. The system is using its own debris as kindling. It is self-reinforcing in a way that makes each successive round easier to initiate than the previous one, as long as the large-scale forcing from the trough above continues to provide the energy needed to ignite the kindling. And there is one more layer to this that reaches further back in time than this week, further back than the Gulf moisture surge, further back than the blocking high, a layer that operates in the stratosphere, miles above the weather-bearing troposphere where everything we have been discussing actually occurs. In the weeks preceding this outbreak, the stratospheric polar vortex, the large-scale circulation of cold air that sits above the Arctic in the upper atmosphere, experienced a disruption event. Stratospheric sudden warming, as these events are technically classified, involves an abrupt and dramatic warming of the stratospheric air mass over the polar region, which weakens and can temporarily displace or even reverse the polar vortex circulation. These events do not immediately affect surface weather, but they propagate downward through the atmosphere over a period of weeks, eventually influencing the jet stream in the troposphere below. The signal from a significant stratospheric warming event typically appears at the surface, somewhere between 2 and 6 weeks after the initial stratospheric disruption, manifesting as jet stream amplification, increased blocking frequency, and more persistent extreme weather patterns of exactly the kind we are watching this week. The atmosphere was not simply primed for this outbreak by the conditions of the past few days. It was primed weeks ago, at altitudes far above where any storm forms, by a disruption that most weather coverage never mentioned because it was happening in a layer of the atmosphere that most people do not know exists. The severe weather this week has roots that reach back further and higher than the models currently being discussed in public forecasts suggest. The system is sustaining itself on fuel that was loaded weeks ago, from sources spanning from the Gulf of Mexico to the lower stratosphere. And that self-sustaining, multi-layered character is precisely what makes this not just another difficult severe weather week. It makes it a window into how the atmosphere behaves when multiple reinforcing mechanisms align simultaneously, and a preview, perhaps, of what that alignment may look like as the background conditions that enable it continue to shift. Part 16. The pattern. Behind the pattern. Here is what makes this particular week more than just a bad week. More than an unfortunate alignment of storms and floods and fires and solar activity that will be cleaned up and forgotten by the following month. More than a dramatic but ultimately isolated chapter in the ongoing record of American severe weather. Early April is not supposed to look like this. Not because severe weather does not occur in April, it does, and April is historically one of the more active months in the severe weather climatology of the central United States. The month sits in the transition zone between the cold season and the warm season, and that transition generates energy. Cold air from the north colliding with warming air from the south. Jet streams still positioned far enough south to provide upper-level support for storm systems. Gulf moisture beginning to surge northward, with increasing frequency and intensity as the ocean surface warms through late winter and early spring. April, severe weather is expected. April, severe weather is planned for. Emergency managers across the plains and Midwest have their spring preparedness protocols activated by April. None of that is the issue. The issue is the character of what we are seeing. The specific combination of atmospheric energy loading, Gulf moisture persistence, jet stream structure, and sustained multi-day instability that we are observing right now is not the character of a typical April severe weather pattern. It is the character of late May. It is the character of early June. The Cape values exceeding 3,000 joules per kilogram, that is peak season fuel loading. The multi-day reload cycle driven by a persistent blocked trough, that is peak season pattern behavior. The dual forcing setups producing atmospheric profiles favorable for long track, significant tornadoes, that is peak season severe weather geometry. These are signatures that climatologists associate with the most active and dangerous period of the annual severe weather cycle, appearing in the record approximately 6 weeks ahead of when that period is supposed to arrive. That early arrival is not a one-year anomaly that can be dismissed as random variability. It is a pattern. And it is a pattern that scientists have been tracking, documenting, debating, and increasingly growing concerned about for more than a decade. The observational record of severe weather outbreaks in the United States is, by global standards, extraordinarily detailed. The country has been systematically documenting tornadoes, large hail events, and significant wind damage reports since the mid-20th century, and the density and quality of that observational network has improved dramatically over the past 30 years with the deployment of Doppler radar, the proliferation of trained storm spotters, and the integration of digital reporting systems that capture events that would previously have gone unrecorded in rural or low population areas. When you analyse that record carefully, accounting for the improvements in detection that make recent decades look more active simply because we are better at seeing what is happening, a signal emerges that is difficult to explain away. The effective severe weather season in the United States appears to be shifting and expanding. The traditional severe weather peak in the southern plains, historically concentrated in May and early June when the jet stream, the moisture supply, and the instability profiles all aligned most favourably over the classic Tornado Alley corridor, appears to be broadening at both ends of its temporal distribution. More significant outbreaks are occurring in February and March, earlier in the calendar than the historical record suggests they should. More significant activity is persisting into October and November, later in the calendar than the historical baseline would predict. The peak itself may be shifting. Some research suggests that the most active severe weather period is moving slightly earlier in the spring, though the statistical confidence on that specific finding varies across different analytical approaches and datasets. The geographic footprint of significant severe weather risk is also showing signs of expansion that are visible in the observational record. The classic tornado alley of the southern and central plains, Oklahoma, Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, eastern Colorado remains active. But higher frequencies of significant tornado outbreaks are appearing in areas that the historical climatology classified as substantially lower risk. The Mid-South Corridor, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, has seen a notable increase in major outbreak frequency over the past 2 to 3 decades. The Southeast more broadly has emerged as a region of growing concern, producing significant tornado events in seasons and at times of year that the traditional severe weather mental map did not flag as primary risk periods. Whether those geographic shifts represent a genuine migration of severe weather climatology or a statistical artifact of improved reporting in regions that were previously underdocumented is a question that researchers are actively working to resolve. The mechanism connecting these observed shifts to the background physical changes occurring in the climate system is not simple, and it would be a disservice to the science to present it as though it were. The relationship between large-scale climate variability, warming ocean temperatures, jet stream behaviour changes, altered atmospheric moisture content, and the frequency, intensity, and geographic distribution of individual severe weather events is one of the most actively researched and genuinely difficult problems in atmospheric science. The complexity runs in multiple directions simultaneously. Warmer temperatures increase the moisture holding capacity of the atmosphere, which increases the fuel available for severe convection. But warmer temperatures also reduce the temperature contrast between the Arctic and the mid-latitudes, which could weaken the jet stream and reduce the wind shear that severe thunderstorms need to rotate. Those two effects work in opposite directions, and the net result depends on which one dominates in any given season, region, and atmospheric configuration. The honest answer from the scientists doing this work is that the relationship is real, it is measurable in aggregate, and it is not yet fully understood at the level of individual events. What you cannot do, what the science explicitly does not support, is point to a specific tornado touching down in central Oklahoma on a Wednesday evening in early April and say that climate change caused this tornado. That is not how the physics works, and stating it that way misleads more than it informs. What you can do, carefully and with appropriate acknowledgement of uncertainty, is point to the background conditions that make certain patterns more probable and observe that those background conditions have been moving in a direction that is consistent with the observed shifts in severe weather climatology. Warmer Gulf of Mexico temperatures increase the moisture available to the atmospheric conveyor that feeds plains severe weather. That is a direct, physically grounded mechanism with strong observational support. A more amplified, more variable jet stream, one that spends more time in extreme configurations, blocking patterns, persistent troughs, creates more frequent and more intense temperature contrast between the Arctic air masses to the north and the tropical air masses to the south. More extreme temperature contrasts produce steeper lapse rates, steeper atmospheric instability profiles, more explosive convective potential when a trigger arrives. More explosive convective potential produces more violent storms, larger hail, stronger tornadoes, more destructive straight-line winds. The chain of physical causation is real. Every link in that chain carries uncertainty about its magnitude and its specific contribution to any individual event, but the chain itself is not speculative. The Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperature anomalies this season are not subtle or ambiguous. They are documented in independent observational datasets, consistent with the multi-year warming trend that researchers have been tracking in the Western Gulf, and physically coherent with the elevated moisture content that is producing the 3,000 joule Cape values loading the atmosphere over the plains this week. Whether those specific anomalies enhance the Cape values by 500 joules per kilogram or 1,000 joules per kilogram, whether they extended the Gulf moisture conveyor by 1 day or 3 days beyond what a cooler Gulf would have supported, whether they are the difference between a significant outbreak and a historic one, those are quantitative questions that require careful modelling work and months of post-event analysis to answer responsibly. The qualitative answer, that warmer Gulf water means more atmospheric fuel, and that this week's atmosphere has more fuel than early April typically carries, is supported by the physics and consistent with the measurements. What is perhaps most striking when you step back from the individual components and look at the pattern of patterns is the growing frequency of events like this one. Not individual tornadoes, not even individual outbreaks, but multi-day, multi-hazard compound events where the atmosphere refuses to follow the normal recovery cycle, where the reload mechanism keeps running when it should be exhausting itself, where forecasters find themselves using the language of patterns rather than events, tracking a persistent feature rather than issuing a warning for a discrete storm. Whether that growing frequency is a genuine physical trend, or partially an artifact of improved observational capacity and more sophisticated modelling systems is a legitimate and unresolved scientific debate. We can see more now than we could 30 years ago. We have more storm spotters, better radar, more sophisticated data assimilation, more sensitive detection thresholds. Some portion of what looks like increasing frequency in the observational record is almost certainly increasing detectability rather than increasing occurrence. But not all of it. The data, taken as a whole, and analysed by researchers who have spent careers trying to separate the signal from the noise, is consistent with a trend that is worth taking seriously even before it is fully characterised. The trend line is real enough that it is showing up across multiple independent data sets, multiple analytical methodologies, multiple research groups working from different starting assumptions. When independent lines of evidence converge on the same general conclusion, that convergence is itself a signal. The calendar says April, the atmosphere says peak season, and that gap, that widening mismatch between what the historical calendar predicts and what the actual atmosphere is delivering, may be the most important thing this week is telling us, not just about the next 5 days, about the next 5 years, about what April starts to look like as the background conditions that define what April can produce continue to shift in the direction the data is already pointing. This week is not a preview of the worst case, it may be a preview of the new normal. And that distinction is worth sitting with long after the storms have passed and the rivers have receded, and the alerts have expired and the forecasters have finally gotten some sleep. Part 17. What happens next? Now we come to the part that actually determines outcomes, not the models, not the probability discussions, not the atmospheric mechanics or the Gulf moisture anomalies, or the stratospheric warming signal that primed all of this weeks before the first storm report came in. The part that determines outcomes is what happens next, and what it means for the people who are not meteorologists, not emergency managers, not storm spotters, but simply people living in the path of a system that has been building towards something all week. Friday is the pivot. Every forecast discussion circulating among operational meteorologists right now, every model run being analysed at the Storm Prediction Centre, every briefing being prepared for state emergency management agencies points to Friday as the day when the atmospheric conditions most fully align. Wednesday's storms are significant, real hazards, real warning operations, real potential for significant tornadoes in the overnight window we have already discussed at length. Thursday's wind event is significant, widespread damaging winds across the Midwest, a large-scale hazard affecting millions of people across a broad swathe of the country. But Friday is when the instability is highest. Friday is when the shear is most organised. Friday is when the dual forcing from the converging dry line and the approaching cold front overlaps most completely. Friday is when the full capability of this system, everything it has been building toward across 5 days of reloading and reorganising, is expressed. What forecasters are watching most closely as Friday approaches is not the instability numbers. The instability numbers are already alarming enough that they are not the variable under debate. What forecasters are watching is storm mode, and if that term is not already in your severe weather vocabulary, it is worth understanding, because it is the difference between a tornado outbreak and a wind damage event, between discrete warnings for individual storms and a wall of hazardous conditions spanning hundreds of miles simultaneously. The distinction between discrete supercells and linear systems, squall lines, is not a technical classification that matters only to meteorologists. It has profound, practical implications for the type and severity of the hazards produced, and for the ability of the warning system to protect people effectively. Discrete supercells are individual, isolated rotating storms. They can be tracked separately on radar. They can be warned for individually, with a warning polygon that tells specific communities to take shelter, while their neighbours a county over remain in the clear. Storm spotters can position themselves near them, observe their structure, confirm rotation visually, and provide the real-time observational data that supplements radar in the warning process. Discrete supercells are the most efficient tornado producers in the atmosphere, and they are also, counterintuitively, the most manageable from a warning perspective precisely because of their individuality. You can see them, you can track them, you can warn for them with meaningful precision. Linear systems, squall lines, are a different animal entirely. A squall line is a continuous band of thunderstorms organised along a frontal boundary, sometimes stretching for hundreds of miles and sweeping through an entire region as a single entity. Squall lines produce tornadoes less efficiently than discrete supercells, but the tornadoes they do produce are frequently embedded within the line, hidden inside the broader convective structure, invisible to visual observers, difficult to isolate on radar because the surrounding storm activity clutters the radar returns that would otherwise highlight the rotation. Embedded tornadoes in squall lines have shorter warning lead times, more erratic motion, and a track record of catching people off guard in ways that discrete supercell tornadoes, for all their violence, often do not. The Friday setup currently favours discrete supercell initiation in the afternoon hours, when the dryline surges east into the unstable air mass ahead of the approaching cold front, and the afternoon heating cycle provides the final trigger for explosive convective development. That discrete supercell phase, if the environment allows it to develop cleanly, is the highest-end tornado scenario of the entire 5-day sequence. Individual supercells tracking northeast through an environment of extreme instability and organised wind shear, each one capable of producing significant tornadoes, large hail, and extreme winds, potentially persisting for hours as they move across the risk corridor. The critical question is whether those discrete supercells can maintain their discrete character as the afternoon progresses. At some point, the exact timing depends on the speed of the cold front and the rate at which the convective mode evolves. The individual supercells will begin to interact with each other and with the approaching frontal boundary. They will cluster, they will merge. The discrete phase will transition toward a more linear organisation. That transition is not a relief. It is a shift in hazard character, not a reduction in hazard magnitude. As the system goes linear, the tornado production efficiency drops, but the wind damage potential increases substantially across a much wider area. The question is not whether severe weather occurs on Friday. The question is what form it takes and how long the discrete phase lasts before the transition. The moderate risk upgrade for Friday, the classification that sits above enhanced risk and below high risk on the SPC's scale, that occurs on roughly 15 to 20 days per year across the entire country, is not a certainty. Nothing at this range is a certainty. A moderate risk requires specific conditions to be met in addition to the already favourable large-scale setup. Primarily it requires that the morning hours on Friday do not produce significant convective initiation ahead of the dryline. If thunderstorms fire in the morning in the target area, drawn out prematurely by residual boundaries from Thursday's storms, or by local terrain effects, or by any of a dozen small-scale triggers that numerical weather prediction models cannot perfectly resolve at extended range, those morning storms consume instability. They stabilize the environment ahead of the afternoon dryline surge. They rob the discrete supercell phase of the pristine high cape environment it needs to produce its most dangerous output. In that scenario, Friday is still a significant severe weather day, but the ceiling of the event is substantially lower. If the morning is quiet, if the atmosphere holds its energy in reserve through the morning hours and delivers it to the afternoon discrete supercell phase intact, then a moderate risk is not just possible, it is the logical consequence of what the atmosphere has been building toward all week. The most likely outcome sits between those two scenarios: a significant severe weather day, probably with multiple tornadoes, definitely with large hail and damaging winds, potentially reaching moderate risk criteria as the system's final details come into focus in the hours before initiation. The worst case scenario: morning quiet, discrete phase extended, extreme instability and organised shear producing long-track significant tornadoes in a high-end outbreak, remains a non-trivial possibility that operational meteorologists are not dismissing. For the person reading this who lives in the risk corridor, in central Oklahoma, in southern Kansas, in North Texas, in the Ozark foothills, in any of the communities that will find themselves inside a watch or warning area at some point on Friday, the important message is not a specific threat level to commit to memory. Threat levels change as the event evolves. The moderate risk that exists or does not exist on Thursday morning may look different by Thursday evening as new model runs come in and the system's details sharpen. What does not change is this: Friday is a day that rewards attention, sustained, calm, prepared attention, not alarm. Alarm is actually dangerous in a prolonged severe weather sequence because alarm is exhausting, and exhaustion produces the worst possible outcome: the person who has been hearing about storms all week and nothing has happened to them personally, who dismisses the Friday evening warning because they have been primed for catastrophe since Wednesday, and it hasn't materialised in their specific backyard, who makes the decision not to shelter at exactly the moment when sheltering matters most. Know your shelter location before Friday, not during the warning, before. Know how you will receive warnings overnight, because the overnight window is real. It will not announce itself with theatrical thunder before it arrives, and a phone that is silenced or a weather radio that is not turned on is not a warning system, it is furniture. The overnight tornado is the one that has historically extracted the highest cost from the people in its path, not because it is stronger, but because it arrives in the dark and the warning system depends on people being awake and prepared to act on it. This is not one storm, it is a system that keeps coming back. And the atmosphere has been consistent about that all week. Not in a way that implies intention, not in a way that suggests the atmosphere is aware of the people living beneath it, but in the way that a self-sustaining physical configuration running on Gulf moisture and upper-level wave energy simply does what the physics allows it to do, day after day, until the physics changes. The pattern will break. Patterns always break. The trough will eventually exit. The moisture conveyor will eventually be disrupted. The blocking high will eventually give way. The energy that has been cycling through this system since Wednesday will eventually be exhausted, and the atmosphere will begin its slow recovery towards something quieter. But not yet. Right now, the system is still loading. The rivers in western New York are still rising toward their crests. The fire weather conditions in the plains are still active. The geomagnetic storm is still interacting with the magnetosphere, and 4 astronauts somewhere beyond the orbit of the International Space Station are moving through the silence of cislunar space, looking back at a planet that from their distance shows no evidence of any of this. Just the thin blue line of the atmosphere at the limb, impossibly delicate, impossibly thin, a layer measuring tens of kilometers in a solar system measuring billions, holding everything we have described this week within its fragile custody. From up there, it is beautiful. From inside it, it is something else entirely. It is a week that will be remembered not because any single component of it was unprecedented, but because everything arrived at once. The storms and the floods and the fires and the blizzard and the solar storm and the moon launch, all of it converging on the same narrow window of days for no reason more mysterious than physics and probability, and the occasional humbling reminder that the systems governing this planet do not consult our calendars before they act. Not by design, not by signal, just by physics. And the question that outlasts this week, the one worth carrying forward into the quieter days that will eventually follow, is whether physics is changing the odds, whether the atmosphere is, in some measurable sense, becoming louder, whether the compound events are becoming more probable, the convergence is more frequent, the gap between what April is supposed to look like and what April actually delivers growing wider with each passing year. We do not have a clean answer yet. The data is building toward one, but we have this week, And this week is not quiet. The sky has a great deal to say right now, and it is saying all of it at once.